He nodded.
高堂さんが新選組で行っていたのは幕府の命令による羅刹を生み出す実験だった。羅刹とはすなわち鬼人のごとき力と驚異的な治癒能力を持つ人間のことだ。
It was the first time she'd heard the word. The doctor paused for a moment to look at her, then continued.
そしてその羅刹を生み出したのは落ち水という薬だ。これは西洋ではエリクサー、中国では先端と呼ばれるものに値する。つまるところ不老不死の霊薬みたいなものだ。
It sounded like more like something from a fairy tale than real life. But there was something in the tone of Dr. Matsumoto's voice that said he was telling the truth. Dr. Matsumoto nodded slowly. Then he pinched the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger. He looked very tired.
そこまで知っていたのか。
They were human, but not human. Perhaps they were something entirely different now? She couldn't see how this water of life could ever be used for good. Even if it had healed Sinan's arm, he'd suffered greatly in the process. It came out more a moan than a question. Her father would never want to ruin the life of another, but because of what he'd done, people had suffered. Some had even died. But it wasn't just her father. And she was sure no one involved had wanted such a terrible outcome.
だからこそ、両親の呵責に耐えかねた高堂さんはここを去ったんだろ
う。しかし、あれは幕府が新選組の戦力増強のために与えてくれた知恵だ。
The doctor only shook his head.
あの計画は失敗だ。行わない方がいい。幕府も見切りをつけているはずだ。
Kondo frowned, perhaps unhappy that Dr. Matsumoto would question the shogunate's original decision.
実験体になった大使たちがどうなったか、それは近藤さんもよく知ってるだろう。あの計画は人道的に決して許されるもんじゃない。
Kondo gave a non-committal grunt and fell silent. She was sure Kondo knew just how dangerous it was to use the water of life, but the shogunate had come to him with a request. Perhaps he was unable to refuse, even if he wanted to. Silence felt like a thick blanket. It had grown almost unbearable when...
部外者に文句を言われる筋合いはありません。
He was especially pale, which seemed to be one of the consequences for being active during the day.
三男君、顔色が悪そうに見えるぞ。
ご心配なく。
He bowed quickly, his mouth a compressed line, and turned to regard the doctor with a cool gaze.
我々は我々の裁量で例の薬を有効に活用させていただいています。
しかし危険だ。あの薬は強すぎる。
研究は続いています。そしてすでにこの私という成功例もあります。
As Sinan did indeed prove, it was possible to drink the water of life and retain your sanity. It just wasn't easy.
確かにそうかもしれん。だが、成功が続くとは限らん。
いいえ、今後も研究と改良を重ねれば 成功率が上がるのは明らかです。
今までと比べて犠牲者が減ればいいという話ではない。無駄死にするものはもうこれ以上一人として増やすべきではなかろう。
彼らは我々の礎となったのです。無駄死にではありません。
しかしだな。
まあ2人とも計画の話は後日改めてということにせんか。
It was her private opinion that they were unlikely to agree, no matter what time they discussed the subject. But she felt it would be polite to keep that to herself.
そうですね。わかりました。
There seemed to be very little in the way of common ground between them, but she could see the merit of both their arguments. Likely Kondo had as well, and had chosen to end things before it got unpleasant.
近藤さんがそうおっしゃるなら。
Senon's face betrayed nothing of what he might be thinking, even with the corner of his mouth quirked up in the beginning of a smile. He bowed once more, and left as swiftly as he'd arrived. Kondo cleared his throat loudly.
そういえば健康診断はどうでしたかな。
ああ、それなんだがな。
Dr. Matsumoto's face took on the look of someone about to discuss something exceedingly grotesque.
怪我人や病人を合計したら全体種の3分の1近くになるじゃないか。
なんと
なんとじゃないぞ近藤さん。あんたらは今まで何をやってたんだ。切り傷から渋り腹までこの豚書は病の見本市だぞ。
そんなことになっていたのか。
まずは病室を用意してそこに病人を運び込んでくれ。それから豚書を清潔にしてもらわんと話にならない。
なるほど、そうであったか。
And so they were ordered to clean the entire compound. The captains complied, although they certainly seemed less enthusiastic about the idea. The following day, Dr. Matsumoto returned for an inspection.
まあまあ綺麗になったじゃないか。
He looked pleased, if not a little smug.
そりゃ死ぬ気で頑張ったからな。
でも掃除は一日休んでただろ。ずるいよな。
土方さんが過保護なんですよ。
うるせえ。お前が変な咳するからだろうが。
Hijikata had any actual concern for Okita's health. His face would not.
しかし、
Yeah.
やはり片付くと気分が良い。
Alright, never mind.
まあな、見違えたもんだ。これはこれで悪くねえ。
よし、これからは毎日掃除するか。
おう、頼んだぜ平介。
なんで俺だけなのさ。体力自慢の新八さんが怠けてどうするんだよ。お、そうかそうか。じゃあ明日から2人で頑張ろうな。
おいおい、ちょっと待て。誰もやらねえとは言ってないだろ
お、まだゴミがあるじゃねえか。ちょうどいい、捨ててこい新八。
いや、だから明日からだろなあ平介。 片付けたそばから暴れるな。誇りが立つ。
She was enjoying their banter so much, she almost didn't notice Okita quietly step outside. She could just see Okita and Dr. Matsumoto outside, walking off somewhere together. Where could they be going, she wondered. Well, obviously it's Okita, so... What were Okita and Dr. Matsumoto doing? Was Okita going to talk to the doctor about his cough? He had been coughing an awful lot lately, now that she thought about it. Was he alright? She decided to follow them. Unfortunately, she'd waited too long, and by the time she made it outside, they were gone.
Hmm? 沖田君たちなら中庭の方に行ったようですが。どういたしまして。急ぎすぎて転ぶんじゃありませんよ。
She bowed quickly and turned to the courtyard, then paused. Should she try to catch up? Or should she go around the back and try to reach the courtyard before they did? It's actually a decision right there. Let's go around. She ducked onto the narrow path that ran around the back, and in moments found herself at the courtyard. She hid herself in the shadows as best she could, and waited. No sooner had she finished than Okita and the doctor appeared.
結論から言おう。お前さんの病は老害だ。
Yep, that's accurate. For just a second, her heart stopped. A shiver ran down her spine, and suddenly, she felt very, very cold. Had he just said...
なんだ、やっぱりあの有名な死病ですか。
Okita has...
驚かないのか。
そりゃ、自分の体ですから。
Okita has tuberculosis. It was all she could do to keep from screaming. Her whole body shook.
でも、面と向かって言われると、さすがに困ったな。
笑い事ではなかろう。
これでも困ってるんですけどね。
As he spoke, he flashed Dr. Matsumoto a quick grin. She was too stunned to make much sense of the rest of the conversation, until the doctor said something that caught her attention.
Actually, 私もあの子に内緒にしてることがある。
Something told her that
行動さんが上位派の過激浪士連中と行動を共にしてるらしいんだが、とてもじゃないが伝えられねえよ。
The news of Okita's illness had her so scattered, and she almost cried out at this new piece of intelligence. Her hands were halfway to being clapped over her mouth when... there was suddenly someone behind her. A hand slipped over her mouth before she'd even had time to react, and an ice cold shiver ran down the length of her spine.
静かにしていろ。
It was a calm, cool voice that she'd heard many times before, although never from quite so close. Saito? Her body relaxed. The body behind her was Saito, not some anonymous assailant.
そのまま動くな。そうじゃ気配に鋭い。
She nodded her head as much as she dared. His hand over her mouth made her so nervous she scarcely dared to breathe. Saito's presence next to her was silent and sharp, like a blade in the night. It seemed like hours had passed before Okida and Matsumoto finally left.
斉藤さんの起点がなければ危ないところでした。
Her eyes widened as Yamazaki stepped out from behind the trees. How long had he? No. Something told her that it would be a foolish question. He'd probably been there the whole time. She did her best to look sufficiently apologetic, which wasn't difficult.
いや、ぶしつけだったのは俺だ。だが、指示に従ってくれたのは助かった。
There was the briefest hint of a smile in his eyes as he spoke, and then it was gone.
それで、掃除のことだが。
His face was a cool, serious mask once again.
病に関しては聞かなかったことにしてくれ。
He wasn't asking her to keep her mouth shut, per se, but rather to forget what she'd seen and heard had ever happened.
あの人が病に倒れるとなれば、内外に与える影響が大きすぎます。それに、老師たちが調子に乗るだけでなく、局長も副長も心配するでしょうから。
He was right. Even she could understand that. But she didn't think she could forget the sight of Okida smiling, even as his death sentence was given to him.
病に関しては俺たちが対処する。お前は気にするな。
She had scarcely opened her mouth to speak when Saito cut her off.
つまり、関わるなということだ。
At the end of the day, she was still only a guest. Whatever influence she had on the Shinsengumi affairs was left to their discretion. She might live amongst the Shinsengumi, but she wasn't one of them. Saito's words had made that very clear. Suddenly she felt cold, as if a gust of wind had blown through, draining all the heat from her body. She was alone. No, I'm not saying cold twice in the same sentence, it's dumb. From then on, Matsumoto visited the compound regularly. He'd check up on the men of the Shinsengumi. The Corps was renamed the Fury Corps, but remained secret. Still, she couldn't help but wonder, was it really alright to continue the research, the creation of Furies? It wasn't long before she began to wish she'd never heard of the Water of Life, or Furies. Translated grammar is never perfect, which is actually a good thing. After the dust cleared, following the Hamaguri Rebellion, the shogun set about cleaning house. The Choshu domain were declared enemies of the court, and the shogun gathered other domains and launched a military campaign known as the Choshu Expedition. It was the intention of the shogunate to completely demolish the Choshu domain, but intervention on the part of the Satsuma and some of the other domains had led to an early end for the expedition with no actual battles fought. Perhaps feeling they dodged a bullet, the Choshu domain fell silent for a time. Their obedience was short-lived, however, and before long their disrespect for the shogun became impossible to ignore. Kondo was asked to accompany an envoy sent out to the Choshu to investigate their behavior, but they refused to even meet with the envoy. Fed up with their insubordination, the shogunate ordered the second Choshu expedition.
みんな大変だ。
巡察の最中、不定老師にでも出くわしたか？
それどころじゃねえ。家持公が亡くなったらしい。
Lord Iemochi, the 14th shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate. She could feel her chest tighten. She'd never seen his face in person, and now they're at most of the Shinsengumi. Even so, Shinsengumi had been assigned to guard him in the past, and he was the symbol of the shogunate.
そりゃ本当か。何もこんな時に。長州征伐はどうなっちまうんだ。次の将軍はもう決まってるのか。
そのあたりはよくわからないけどよ。
大将なしで戦争するってのはさすがにな。兵隊の士気も上がらねえだろ
う。なんかよ、嫌な予感がするんだよな。この前も長州藩を攻めきれないで帰ってきちまったからな。今度もそうならなきゃいいんだけどよ。
She tried to convince herself that a single domain couldn't cause much of a problem, but she couldn't shake that feeling of dread. Soon afterward, the shogunate led a massive army against the Choshu, but the expense of the war weighed heavily on the coffers and of other domains, and they fielded fewer troops than the shogunate had hoped for. The death of Iemochi was another blow to army morale, and some domains withdrew from the war entirely. So it was that the second Choshu expedition ended in a shocking defeat. That was a moment when the shogunate government, stable for 260 years, began to waver. She swept her hand across her face, wiping away several new beads of sweat. Kyoto was a nice city, but she could certainly have done without the humid heat.
そうだな。
Beneath his usual calm, there was a hint of alertness and carefully restrained violence, and for good reason. Choshu had been declared enemies of the court after the Hamaguri rebellion and driven out of Kyoto, but some feared the remnants of their forces had remained behind in hiding. Now more than ever, Saito and the rest of the Shinsengumi had to be alert and focused when on patrol.
とりあえずあそこの店から回ってみる。お前は店の前で待ってろ。中にいても手持ち無沙汰だろう。
He gave her a short nod of confirmation and stepped into the shop with his men.
新選組だ。店を改めさせてもらう。
She'd been waiting for Saito and his division for a few minutes when she noticed a commotion nearby.
おいおいおい、道を開けやがれ。勤王の獅子様がお通りだ。
A number of rather unpleasant-looking ronin were making their way into her general direction, yelling, threatening, and generally intimidating anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. Patriots? Hardly. Perhaps they considered themselves loyal to the imperial court, but they looked like the sort who would only use their supposed patriotism as an excuse to steal and kill. These were just the sort of men whom the Shinsengumi was charged with subduing.
ほら、邪魔だって言ってんだろ。
The ronin tossed a poorly aimed kick at a child playing in the street. She'd barely taken a single step toward them when...
やめなさいよ、みっともない。
She didn't see where she'd come from, but a girl had run out to place herself between the ronin and the child.
あ あなんだてめえは。
たかが女が俺たち勤王の志士に意見するってのか？
The man's obviously short fuse had been lit. He made a grab for the girl and missed. She suspected his next attack wouldn't be quite so inaccurate. She couldn't let that happen.
なんだお前は。その女の知り合いか？
知り合いじゃねえんなら突っ込んでろ。
Flecks of spit flew from his mouth as he roared to her. Her legs suddenly felt somewhat weaker than they had a moment ago. But she was committed. She couldn't run now.
なんだと？そうだそうだ、いいぞ兄ちゃん。
獅子気取りの不良老子め、今日からさっさと出ていけ。
Something about her speech seemed to have struck a chord with the crowd that had begun to gather. With the cheers, her legs started to regain some of their usual steadiness.
くそ、バカにしやがって。
With the rough hiss of metal, the Ronin's sword left from its scabbard. She suddenly discovered she had difficulty swallowing. She could try and dodge, but if she did, he might hit the girl her actions had intended to protect. No, that wasn't an option. She shut her eyes. Slowly, carefully, she opened her eyes.
安心しろ、峰打ちだ。
貴様。
そいつを屯所に連れて行け。長州の残党かもしれん。
はい。
Working quickly, Saito's men set to work binding the Ronin for transport. Saito's cold eyes fell on her.
無茶をするな。何故俺を呼ばない？
そうよ、無茶なことしちゃって。あんなの私一人でも大丈夫だったのに。
A scolding from Saito was expected, but she hadn't thought that her erstwhile damsel in distress would contribute. She gave her a short, slightly confused bow, to which she blinked as if suddenly remembering something very important.
でも私あなたに助けてもらったのよね。まだお礼を言ってなかったわ。ありがとう。あなた勇気があるのね。老子相手に立ち向かうなんて普通できないわ。
She raised a dainty hand to her mouth in a poor attempt to stifle a giggle.
謙遜なんてしなくていいわよ。これも何かの縁だと思うし、女の子同士仲良くしましょうね。
Saito glanced from her to her, and an expression flickered across his face that she couldn't quite place.
見る者が見ればわかることだ。動揺するな。
あら、もしかして内緒だったの？まずかったのかしら。
She wasn't entirely sure of how to respond. How does a person respond to that sort of question? She seemed to sense her confusion, and gracefully moved on.
あ、ところでまだお名前を伺ってなかったわね。これも何かの縁ですもの。教えてくれる？
It seemed only polite to introduce him first, being that he was a good deal more important than her. But the girl seemed to have other ideas.
そちらの方は斉藤さんよね。新選組は有名なもの知ってるわ。で、あなたの名前は？よろしくね。私のことはセンって呼んで。なんか水臭いな。見たところ同い年ぐらいだし、そんなにかしこまらなくっていいわよ。まあ許容範囲かな。うん、そう呼んでくれると嬉しいな。
She grasped her hand between her own, her face open and earnest.
じゃ、また会いましょうね。
She gave her hand a gentle squeeze, then turned and left, her kimono flapping behind her. Their encounter was over before she'd had a chance to grasp what was even happening, so she simply stood, stunned, for a moment or two. She glanced up uncertainly at Saito. If it wasn't, then how had Sen, whom she'd just met, been able to tell immediately that she was a girl? She had to admit she felt like it was a pretty good disguise. Saito looked down at her, a strange expression on his face.
さあな。
His only response was a flicker of a smile. She opened her mouth to protest.
そろそろ場所を変えるぞ。これじゃいつまで経っても見回りきれない。
He spun on his heel and marched off down the street. Yes, it's pronounced protest, but protest. Yeah. In any event, we will leave it for there and continue back when we make our way towards the headquarters. Until then.